Look, I need to tell someone about this mess at work because it's driving me absolutely crazy, and honestly, I think I'm losing my mind over it. I'm Chelsea, I'm 24, and I've been dealing with this situation for almost a year now, and it's getting worse every single day. So we hired this guy Dan about 12 months ago, and from day one, something was off about him. Like, seriously off. He's 27, seems normal enough on paper, but the way he acts around women is just weird. And frankly, it's starting to really tick me off. The first few weeks he was here, we all tried to be welcoming, because that's what you do when someone new starts, right? Me and the other girls. There's Megan, who sits 2 desks over from me, and Sarah, who's in the cubicle behind mine. We all made an effort to include him in conversations, invite him to lunch, ask about his weekend plans, normal workplace stuff. But this guy would give us these super short answers and then just walk away or turn back to his computer, like we weren't even there. At first we thought maybe he was just shy or nervous about the new job, but it became pretty clear pretty fast that wasn't the case. What really started to bug me was how he'd cut conversations short whenever any of us women tried to talk to him about anything that wasn't directly work-related. Like, I'd ask him if he had any fun weekend plans and he'd just say, "Not really," and then immediately start typing or looking at papers or whatever. But then I'd see him talking to the guys about sports or movies or whatever for like 20 minutes at a time. It was so obvious and honestly kind of rude. The breaking point for me was when I invited him to join our lunch group one day. We always go to this little place down the street, and it's usually pretty fun. And he just said, "Thanks, but I have other plans," without even looking up from his desk. But then, later that same day, I saw him laughing and joking around with Jake and Marcus from accounting like they were best friends or something. It was like a totally different person. Between you and me, it started to feel personal pretty quickly. I mean, I'm generally pretty good with people, and I've never had someone just completely ignore me like that. Megan noticed it too, and Sarah was getting frustrated because she'd tried multiple times to strike up conversations with him, and he'd just give her these one-word answers before walking away. We started talking about it more and more because it was just so bizarre. What made it even weirder was watching him with the male coworkers. He'd join their conversations about random stuff, laugh at their jokes, even participate in their little work fantasy football thing they had going. But with us, nothing. Absolutely nothing beyond good morning and have a good evening, and even those felt forced and fake. I tried giving him the benefit of the doubt for a while, thinking maybe he was just awkward around women, or maybe he had some social anxiety issues or something. But the more I watched him interact with everyone else, the more it became obvious that this was a deliberate choice he was making. He was choosing not to be friendly with the women in the office while being perfectly normal and social with all the guys. Sarah was the first one to say what we were all thinking, that his behavior was creating this weird, uncomfortable atmosphere where the women felt excluded and unwanted. Like, why should we have to walk on eggshells around this guy when he's clearly capable of normal human interaction? It just didn't make sense, and honestly, it was starting to really get under my skin in a way that surprised me. The more we talked about it, the more frustrated we all became. Here we were, trying to be welcoming and inclusive, and this guy was just shutting us down at every turn while being buddy-buddy with all the men. It felt wrong and unfair, and frankly, it was starting to affect how I felt about coming to work every day. Something had to give, and I was getting tired of pretending like his behavior was acceptable when it clearly wasn't. I started paying way more attention to Dan's patterns after that, and honestly, what I discovered made everything so much worse. Like, I'm not usually the type to analyze someone's every move, but his behavior was so obviously problematic that I felt like I needed to understand what was really going on. And trust me, once I started looking closer, the evidence was everywhere. Every single morning, Dan would walk in, say good morning to the general room, and then immediately start conversations with whatever guys were around. He'd ask Jake about his weekend, joke around with Marcus about some TV show they both watched, even chat with our supervisor about random stuff for 10 or 15 minutes. But when any of us women would try to join these conversations or start our own with him, he'd suddenly become all business and professional. It was like watching someone flip a switch. I started keeping track of specific incidents because I couldn't believe how blatant it was getting. Like this one time, Megan mentioned she was having car trouble and was stressed about getting it fixed. And Dan was literally standing right there, but didn't offer any help or even acknowledge what she said. But later that same day, when Marcus mentioned his car was making weird noises, Dan spent 20 minutes giving him advice about mechanics and even offered to take a look at it. 20 minutes. For a guy you'd known for less than a year, while completely ignoring a woman asking for the exact same type of help. The lunch situation got even more ridiculous. We'd see him eating alone or sometimes joining the guys when they went out, but he never once accepted any invitation from us women. Sarah tried inviting him to join our group probably 6 different times, and every single time he had some excuse. But then he'd go grab coffee with the guys or join them for their after-work drinks, like it was no big deal. It was so obvious that he was actively avoiding us, and honestly, it was starting to feel really personal and hurtful. What really got to me was how different his whole personality seemed to be, depending on who he was talking to. With the guys, he was funny and relaxed and normal. He'd make jokes, share stories about his life, even complain about stuff like traffic or his apartment or whatever. But with us, everything was yes ma'am and no ma'am and these super formal, cold responses that made every interaction feel awkward and uncomfortable. Megan pointed out that he never asked any of us personal questions either. Like he'd ask the guys about their hobbies, their families, their weekend plans, but he never showed any curiosity about our lives outside of work. It was like he saw us as robots who only existed during business hours, while the male coworkers were actual people worth getting to know. The breaking point came during this team meeting we had, where everyone was supposed to share something interesting about themselves. All the guys got these engaged, curious responses from Dan. He asked follow-up questions, made connections to his own experiences, even laughed at their stories. But when it was my turn to talk about my weekend hiking trip, he just nodded politely and didn't say a single word. Same thing happened to Sarah when she talked about her photography hobby, and to Megan when she mentioned her volunteer work. Just polite nods and silence. After that meeting, the 3 of us grabbed coffee and really talked about what was happening. We all agreed that his behavior was beyond weird. It was actually creating this hostile environment where we felt excluded and unwelcome in our own workplace. Sarah said she'd never experienced anything like it, and Megan mentioned that she was starting to dread coming to work because she felt so awkward and uncomfortable around him. I realized that what bothered me most was how unfair the whole situation was. Here we were, trying to be friendly and inclusive and create a positive work environment for everyone, and this guy was just shutting us down while rewarding the men with his normal, social personality. It felt discriminatory, honestly, and I was getting tired of pretending like it wasn't affecting all of us. Something needed to be done about Dan's behavior, and it was becoming clear that being patient and understanding wasn't going to change anything. The situation with Dan escalated to a whole new level when I decided I needed to really understand what was going on because his behavior was just too bizarre to ignore anymore. I mean, I'm not normally someone who obsesses over coworkers, but this was affecting my entire work experience, and I felt like I had every right to figure out what his deal was. So I started paying closer attention to everything he did, and what I discovered was honestly shocking. First thing I did was check out his social media profiles, because I figured that might give me some insight into his personality and whether he was just antisocial in general, or if this was specifically about women. Turns out, his Facebook and Instagram showed a completely different person. Someone who was social and outgoing with mixed groups of friends, posting pictures from parties and hangouts with both men and women. So clearly he was capable of normal social interaction with women outside of work, which made his behavior at the office even more confusing and, frankly, more insulting. I started timing my breaks and lunch schedule, to coincide with his, just to observe how he interacted with different people throughout the day. What I found was this incredibly consistent pattern where he'd be warm and engaging with male coworkers, but cold and professional with all the women. Like, I watched him spend 45 minutes helping Jake troubleshoot some computer issue, joking around and being totally relaxed the whole time. But when Sarah asked him a simple question about a project they were both working on, he gave her a 2-sentence answer and walked away. The more I watched, the more evidence I collected of what I was becoming convinced was discriminatory behavior. I started writing things down because the pattern was so clear and so problematic. Dan would participate in group conversations, but he'd direct all his comments and questions toward the men in the group. He'd volunteer to help male coworkers with projects or problems, but never offered assistance to any of the women, even when we were obviously struggling with something. He'd laugh at jokes made by guys but respond to similar attempts at humor from women with polite silence. Megan and Sarah were totally supportive when I shared what I was discovering, and they started paying closer attention too. We realized that Dan had been invited to join the guys' group chat where they talked about sports and made plans for after-work activities. But none of us women had ever been included in anything like that. He was literally creating this separate social circle that excluded all the female employees while acting like that was perfectly normal and acceptable. The most frustrating part was watching other people not seem to notice or care about what was happening. The male coworkers were perfectly happy with Dan because he treated them well, so they didn't see any problem with his behavior. Even our supervisor didn't seem to pick up on the fact that Dan was creating this 2-tiered system where men got his friendship and social interaction while women got bare minimum professional courtesy. Sarah suggested that maybe we should document specific incidents more formally, because what we were experiencing felt like it could actually be against company policy. So we started keeping track of dates and times when Dan's differential treatment was particularly obvious. Like the time he offered to cover Jake's shift when Jake had a family emergency, but when Megan had a similar situation 2 weeks later, Dan didn't say a word or offer any help. Or when he brought in homemade cookies to share with the guys, but didn't offer any to the women in the office. I also started asking subtle questions to the male coworkers to see what Dan was like during their social interactions outside of work. Turns out he was completely normal, funny, engaging, willing to talk about personal stuff and share stories about his life. Marcus mentioned that Dan had told them about his family, his hobbies, even some dating stories. Meanwhile, none of us women knew anything about his personal life because he refused to share even the most basic information with us. The evidence was becoming overwhelming that Dan was deliberately treating the women in our office differently than the men, and it was creating this hostile work environment where we felt excluded and devalued. I mean, we were all doing the same job and deserving of the same basic courtesy and social interaction, but Dan had decided that only the male employees were worth treating like actual human beings. By this point, I was convinced that Dan's behavior constituted workplace discrimination, and I was tired of just accepting it and hoping it would change. The three of us decided it was time to take action and file a formal complaint, because what was happening wasn't fair, and it wasn't something we should have to tolerate just to keep our jobs. The day I decided to file the complaint with HR was honestly one of the most validating moments I'd had in months, because I finally felt like I was doing something concrete about Dan's unacceptable behavior, instead of just suffering through it every single day. I'd reached my absolute breaking point the week before when we had this group lunch invitation situation that was so blatantly discriminatory that I couldn't ignore it anymore. What happened was, Jake and Marcus were organizing this lunch outing to celebrate finishing a big project, and they invited everyone in our department. When they asked Dan if he wanted to join, he immediately said yes and started talking about how he'd been wanting to try that restaurant for months. But then, when the conversation turned to logistics, and Sarah mentioned she'd need to move some meetings around to make it work, Dan suddenly changed his tune and said he actually couldn't make it after all because he had other commitments. It was so obvious that he didn't want to go if women were going to be there, and honestly, it was humiliating for all of us. That same week, I watched Dan accept an invitation to grab drinks with the guys after work, joking around about how he needed to unwind after a stressful day. But when Megan casually mentioned that a group of us were planning to check out this new happy hour place and he should join us, he gave her this cold, "Thanks, but I have plans" response, without even looking up from his computer. The double standard was so blatant and so insulting that I knew I couldn't keep pretending like this was normal or acceptable behavior. So I scheduled a meeting with HR and asked Megan and Sarah to come with me because I wanted them to share their experiences too. I spent the night before organizing all the documentation I'd been keeping. Specific dates and incidents where Dan's differential treatment was most obvious. Examples of how his behavior was affecting our work environment, and evidence that he was capable of normal social interaction, but was choosing not to extend that courtesy to the women in our office. The HR meeting went exactly how I hoped it would. The representative, Lisa, took our complaint very seriously and asked detailed questions about Dan's behavior patterns. She seemed particularly concerned when we explained how Dan's selective socializing was creating this atmosphere where the women felt excluded and undervalued compared to our male colleagues. When I showed her my documentation of specific incidents, she said it was clear that we'd been experiencing something that needed to be investigated. Lisa explained that what we were describing could potentially constitute discrimination based on gender, and that creating different treatment standards for male and female employees was something the company took very seriously. She assured us that they would conduct a thorough investigation and interview other employees to get a complete picture of what was happening. I felt so validated hearing her say that our experiences were legitimate workplace concerns and not just us being overly sensitive like I'd started to worry we might be. The best part was when Lisa told us that she'd be speaking with Dan directly about his behavior and making it clear that all employees needed to be treated with equal courtesy and respect, regardless of gender. She said that if the investigation confirmed our complaints, there would be consequences for Dan and requirements for him to change his behavior going forward. Finally, someone in authority was taking this situation seriously and recognizing that what we'd been dealing with wasn't acceptable. After the meeting, I felt this huge sense of relief and empowerment. For months, I'd been feeling frustrated and helpless about Dan's treatment of us, but now I'd taken concrete action to address the problem. Megan and Sarah were both grateful that I'd initiated the complaint process, and we all agreed that we'd done the right thing by speaking up instead of continuing to suffer in silence. I'll admit, part of me was looking forward to seeing how Dan would react when HR confronted him about his behavior. I figured he'd either have to apologize and start treating us with basic human decency, or he'd get defensive and reveal his true colors, which would only support our case. Either way, I was confident that the investigation would vindicate our complaints and force Dan to change his discriminatory behavior toward the women in our office. Everything started falling apart when HR called me back for what I thought was going to be a follow-up meeting to tell me about the consequences Dan was facing for his discriminatory behavior. Instead, I walked into that conference room and got hit with information that completely blindsided me and honestly made me question everything I thought I knew about the situation. Lisa started the meeting by explaining that they'd completed their investigation and had spoken with Dan about our complaints. But instead of telling me about his punishment or the behavior changes he'd be required to make, she started talking about his perspective on the situation and how he'd provided context for his workplace interactions. I was already getting a bad feeling about where this was heading, but nothing could have prepared me for what she told me next. Apparently, Dan had explained to HR that he maintains strict professional boundaries with female colleagues because of an incident at his previous job where casual friendships with women in the workplace led to harassment accusations against him. He told them that he'd been falsely accused by a female coworker who misinterpreted their friendly interactions as romantic interest, and that the situation had nearly cost him his career and reputation. So now he follows what he called a professional courtesy-only policy with women at work to protect himself from similar misunderstandings. I was absolutely stunned. Lisa was sitting there explaining this like it somehow justified Dan's behavior, like his past experience gave him the right to treat all women in the workplace as potential threats who didn't deserve basic social interaction. I tried to explain that regardless of his reasons, his differential treatment was still creating a hostile work environment for us. But Lisa seemed more focused on his legal right to maintain professional boundaries than on how his behavior affected the women in our department. The worst part was when she told me that several of the male co-workers had come forward to support Dan during the investigation. Apparently, Jake and Marcus and even our supervisor had all confirmed that Dan had shared his previous workplace experience with them and that they understood and supported his decision to keep things strictly professional with female colleagues. I felt completely betrayed. Here I thought these guys were our friends and co-workers, but when it came down to it, they sided with Dan and acted like his discriminatory behavior was perfectly reasonable. Then Lisa dropped the real bombshell. She said that during their investigation, several employees had expressed concern about the way me, Megan, and Sarah had been monitoring and discussing Dan's behavior. Apparently, people had noticed us watching him, timing our breaks to observe his interactions, and constantly talking about him among ourselves. Some coworkers had described our behavior as obsessive and uncomfortable, and a few people had actually complained that we were creating workplace drama and making them feel awkward about their own interactions with Dan. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Somehow, we'd gone from being the victims of discrimination to being accused of harassment ourselves. Lisa explained that systematically monitoring a coworker's behavior, documenting their social interactions, and creating a hostile environment through constant discussion and complaint could actually constitute workplace harassment under company policy. She said that while our feelings were valid, our response to the situation had crossed some lines and made other employees uncomfortable. The meeting ended with Lisa telling me that they weren't going to take any action against Dan because his behavior, while perhaps unfriendly, didn't violate any company policies and was actually within his rights as an employee. But she said that me, Megan, and Sarah would need to attend mandatory sensitivity training about appropriate workplace behavior and professional boundaries. She also mentioned that they'd be monitoring the situation to make sure there were no further incidents of harassment or hostile behavior. I walked out of that meeting feeling completely humiliated and confused. How had a situation where we were clearly being discriminated against turned into us being the ones in trouble? I still believed that Dan's behavior was wrong and unfair, but apparently the company disagreed and thought that we were the problem. It was the most frustrating and invalidating experience I'd ever had at work, and I had no idea how to process what had just happened. The aftermath of that HR meeting was honestly the most humiliating and devastating period of my entire career, and I'm still trying to process how everything went so completely wrong when I was just trying to address legitimate workplace discrimination. What happened next was like watching my professional life implode in slow motion. And the worst part is that everyone acted like I deserved it. Within a week of our sensitivity training sessions, word had somehow spread throughout the entire office about the investigation and its outcome. I never found out exactly who leaked the information, but suddenly everyone knew that me, Megan, and Sarah had filed harassment complaints against Dan, and that HR had concluded we were the ones engaging in inappropriate behavior. The looks I started getting from coworkers were a mixture of awkwardness, judgment, and sometimes outright hostility. Like I'd become this toxic person who created drama and made everyone's work life more difficult. The social dynamics in our department completely shifted, and not in our favor. People who used to include us in lunch plans and casual conversations started keeping their distance, like they were afraid we'd document their interactions and file complaints about them too. Even worse, I noticed that several coworkers were going out of their way to be extra friendly and inclusive with Dan, almost like they were making a point about how unreasonable our complaints had been. Watching him get treated like some kind of victim who needed protection from us was absolutely infuriating. My relationship with Megan and Sarah started falling apart too, which was devastating because I'd thought we were united in this situation. Sarah was the first to turn on me, claiming that I'd pressured her into filing the complaint and that she'd never really thought Dan's behavior was that problematic. She said she'd just gone along with it because she didn't want to disagree with me. But now she regretted getting involved and blamed me for the professional consequences she was facing. Megan held out longer, but eventually she started making comments about how maybe we'd misread the situation and that we should have just accepted Dan's professional boundaries instead of making such a big deal about everything. The final blow came when I learned that Dan had been offered a promotion to a different department, effective immediately. HR framed it as a lateral move that would be beneficial for his career development, but it was obvious that they were rewarding him for handling our complaints professionally while essentially removing him from our toxic presence. Meanwhile, I had this formal reprimand in my file that would affect my performance reviews and any future promotion opportunities. Dan got advancement and validation, while I got labeled as a troublemaker who couldn't handle normal workplace interactions. What made everything even worse was that I started experiencing exactly the kind of social isolation that I'd accused Dan of creating. Coworkers would have conversations that stopped when I approached, lunch invitations that mysteriously didn't include me, and this general atmosphere of people being polite but distant whenever they had to interact with me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the one eating lunch alone and feeling excluded from office social dynamics, but unlike Dan's situation, mine was the direct result of my own actions and poor judgment. My work performance started suffering because I was so distracted and demoralized by the whole situation. I'd spend half my day obsessing over how unfairly I'd been treated and trying to figure out how to salvage my reputation, instead of focusing on my actual job responsibilities. My supervisors started making comments about my attitude and productivity, which only added to my stress and made me realize that my position at the company might not be secure long-term. The worst part of all of this is that I still don't fully understand how I became the villain in a situation where I genuinely believed I was addressing workplace discrimination. Dan continues to maintain his professional boundaries with female colleagues, which apparently everyone now sees as perfectly reasonable and appropriate. While I'm stuck with this reputation as someone who creates unnecessary drama and can't handle professional relationships like a mature adult. I've basically become a cautionary tale about what happens when you misinterpret workplace dynamics and let your personal feelings interfere with professional judgment. Even though I still think there was something unfair about how Dan treated us differently than the male employees. Looking back, maybe I should have just accepted that some people prefer to keep work relationships strictly professional. But at the time, it felt so personal and discriminatory that I couldn't just ignore it. Now I'm dealing with the consequences of that decision every single day, and honestly, I'm not sure my career will ever recover from this mess.